Hello, everybody. My name is Lylah Tunney, and for the poetry presentation, I chose to do The Change. This is by Tony Hoagland, and this was published in 2003. As I'm presenting, feel free to, if you have any questions or comments on anything, feel free to let me know because I would like to hear from you guys. So let's get right into it. Now, Tony Hoagland was born on November 19th in 1953 in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, but he did not grow up here actually. He grew up on various military bases because his father was an army doctor, and so he grew up in Hawaii, Ethiopia, and Texas, to name a few, which I thought was pretty interesting about him. He taught creative writing at the University of Houston. He actually graduated from three different colleges. He was an American poet. He wrote a poetry collection called What Narcissism Means to Me, and this was a finalist for the National Books Critics Circle Award, as well as many other of his works were critically acclaimed. And he died on October 23rd, 2018, at 64 years old. He passed away from pancreatic cancer. Now, Tony had two siblings. He had an older sister and he had a twin brother who actually died of drug overdose in high school. He got married to Kathleen Lee. She was an avid reader of fiction, and she loved Tony's work. They didn't have any children. His friends described him as quirky, zany, and rebellious. He had just kind of a fun personality. He was a good person to be around. And he grew up in a period of lots of changes, such as the Cold War, the digital revolution, and the 9/11 attacks. And this, I feel like, makes him relevant to speak about what he speaks about in his poem, The Change, because as he was growing up, he experienced a lot of these changes. Now, I'm going to read this poem aloud because I could not find a video of Tony reading it himself, so I included the text down below. Feel free to follow along if you would like to read along or just listen to me speak. The season turned like the page of a glossy fashion magazine. In the park, the daffodils came up, and in the parking lot, the new car models were on parade. Sometimes I think that nothing really changes. The young girls show the latest crop of tummies, and the new president proves that he's a dummy. But remember the tennis match we watched that year? Right before our eyes, some tough little European blonde pitted against that big black girl from Alabama, cornrowed hair and Zulu bangles on her arms, some outrageous name like Vondella Aphrodite. We were just walking past the lounge and got sucked in by the screen above the bar, and pretty soon we started to care about who won, putting ourselves into each whacked return as the volleys went back and back, like some contest between the old world and the new. And you loved her complicated hair and her to hell with everybody's stare, and I couldn't help wanting the white girl to come out on top, because she was one of my kind, my tribe, with her pale eyes and thin lips, and because the black girl was so big and so black, so unintimidated, hitting the ball like she was driving the Emancipation Proclamation down Abraham Lincoln's throat, like she wasn't asking anyone's permission. There are moments when history passes you so close you can smell its breath. You can reach your hand out and touch it on its flank. And I don't watch all that masterpiece theater, but I could feel the end of an era there in front of those bleachers full of people in their Sunday tennis watching clothes. As that black girl worn down her opponent, then kicked her ass good, then thumped her once more for good measure, and stood up on the red clay court, holding her racket over her head like a guitar. And the little pink judge had to climb up on a box to put the ribbon on her neck, still managing to smile into the camera flash, even though everything was changing. And in fact, everything had already changed. Poof, remember? It was the 20th century almost gone. We were there. And when we went to put it back where it belonged, it was past us and we were changed. So for this analysis, this in-depth analysis that I'll be doing, I've underlined some different things in the poem, color-coded just so it's easier for you guys to see. The pink is going to be like similes, personification, and metaphors. The blue is just diction and choices that I notice that the author puts in there to kind of add on to the deeper meaning of the poem. The green is going to be just some rhymes. This orange is contrast or juxtaposition, and this purple is going to be imagery or description. So let's get right into it. The season turned like the page of a glossy fashion magazine, though. This is a really strong simile that I noticed right off of the bat. This glossy fashion magazine kind of adds on to what we think we know is new and like fancy. In the park, the daffodils came up, and in the parking lot, the new car models were on parade. So, this mention of daffodils and car models, we kind of get the sense that it's springtime. Daffodils usually bloom in spring. And so this whole three lines here have a really new and glossy and fancy kind of vibe to it. Sometimes I think that nothing really changes. So this mention of nothing really changes, we notice that the narrator is speaking directly to us, the audience, not just to a general audience or anything, but directly to us as if we are listening. And it also kind of implies that there's a conversational tone going on here. The young girls show the latest crop of tummies, and the new president proves that he's a dummy. Now, here's kind of just a fun rhyme, tummies and dummy rhyme, and so it's kind of just describing how the narrator feels about change and how he feels that that's as if nothing is really changing to him. And again, this tone is conversational and informal. We're kind of noticing this as the poem begins. But remember the tennis match we watched that year? This remember signifies the narrator is describing a memory. So this isn't happening as he's speaking, but he is recalling something that already happened to him right before our eyes. So the use of we and our is telling us that we are a part of the story, not like we're just listening to him recall this, but we're actually a part of this memory, like as if we were actually there. Some tough little European blonde pitted against that big black girl from Alabama. So obviously there's some contrast here between these two tennis players that he's describing. He uses words like little and big to kind of set them apart. Cornrowed hair and Zulu bangles on her arms, some outrageous name like Vondella Aphrodite. So this is some clear imagery that we have here. It's a vivid description of the black character, giving her some detail, some physical attributes, and helping us get a general sense of how the narrator is describing this character. We were just walking past the lounge and got sucked in by the screen above the bar. So this is a metaphor that can kind of be passed over easily because you can't literally get sucked into a screen, but this is just a way of saying that they got really involved and really excited about this match that they're watching. They started paying full attention to it, and pretty soon we started to care about who won. So this kind of is a point where we're getting more suspenseful, more intense. The mood is kind of changing. We're kind of paying more attention to what the narrator is describing as being suspenseful and intense. Putting ourselves into each whacked return as the volleys went back and forth and back. Now, this mention of back and forth and back is, in my opinion, a good example of imagery because instead of just saying back and forth, like it's just going back and forth, this back and forth and back, it kind of helps us imagine where the ball is going and helps us feel as if we're actually recalling the memory as well. Like some contest between the old world and the new. So this is another simile included here. It's not literally a contest, but it's similar to a contest. And it's also the mention of the old world and the new, like different changes battling for dominance. And you loved her complicated hair and her to hell with everybody's stare. So obviously there is a rhyme here. We have hair and stare, and it's describing how we feel about this character. So there's some contrast between you and I here because we're talking as if I am the person who loves her complicated hair, and as if the narrator is talking about how he has a different opinion than us. I couldn't help wanting the white girl to come out on top. So the narrator here is putting the blame off of himself because he can't help it, as he is saying here in the poem. Because she was one of my kind, my tribe, with her pale eyes and thin lips. So this description here is kind of explaining why the narrator thinks the way he does, of the character, the white character being similar to the narrator, and he's just unfamiliar with this black character, and so that's why he feels the way he does. And because the black girl was so big and so black, so unintimidated. So this repetition of so, it acts as a good descriptor, because we're just getting this sense of how the narrator feels about this character, like she was so big and so black, so unintimidated. The narrator correlates her race with her demeanor. So her being black, the narrator interprets her as being unintimidated, being someone brave and scary and fierce, and we're really getting a sense of this here. Hitting the ball like she was driving the Emancipation Proclamation down Abraham Lincoln's throat. This is an incredible simile here. I notice how the narrator includes the Emancipation Proclamation, which back in the 1800s was freeing the slaves. And Abraham Lincoln passed this bill, and so like she was hitting the ball down Abraham Lincoln's throat. We can really get this clear image here of this brave black character doing that. Like she wasn't asking anyone's permission. Again, the audience can imagine this character very clearly the way the narrator is describing her. There are moments when history passes you so close you can smell its breath. You can reach your hand out and touch it on its flank. Now, here's some really good example of personification. It describes this history with having human traits, and so it kind of allows us to feel like this history is right next to us. The narrator references Masterpiece Theater. Now, this is a show back in the day, and this is important because it allows us to give a glimpse of how the narrator is interpreting this moment and his past experiences that he has had. So when he references this, it allows us to get a feel for the experiences he's had. But I could feel the end of an era there in front of those bleachers full of people in their Sunday tennis watching clothes. Now, this is an example of contrast that I had to really dig deep into and see for myself because but I could feel the end of an era there. This is a really monumental moment, but it's contrasted with just people, normal people watching tennis. And so this is an important moment because we can feel these two, this unimportant tennis match and this important feeling that are kind of contrasting. As that black girl wore down her opponent, then kicked her ass good. Now, this is a good example of diction. We can tell again that this author or that this narrator is being informal and conversational and blunt, like he's just having a conversation with one of his friends. Then thumped her once more for good measure. Um, Again, it's helping us paint a more vivid image of this black character. And stood up on the red clay court, holding her racket over her head like a guitar. Another simile here. There are a lot of similes in this piece of work. This is comparing the girl's tennis racket to a guitar, and so it's like she's bold and brave, and just ambitious. And this part contrasts lines 35 and 43. We've got this really monumental kind of feeling here, and then it moves into right back into this author's or this narrator's tone of being just informal. And the little pink judge had to climb up on a box. So we get this picture of the little pink judge, this description, we imagine is kind of stout, kind of short, stubby. Um, had to climb up on a box to put the ribbon on her neck. So there's sort of a contrast here between the tennis player and the judge, although I didn't underline it here, but I still believe that there's a contrast because we have this little tennis player and he's climbing up on a stool to reach this um, tennis player, still managing to smile into the camera flash, even though everything was changing. So this implies that the judge feels the same way as the narrator about this change, because he says, still managing to smile as if he shouldn't be smiling in the first place. Even though everything was changing, and in fact, everything had already changed. This is a specific contrast where we are reminded that this is a memory because I personally forgot that as I was reading the poem that this is just a memory and it wasn't actually happening. And so this sets us apart and says this is actually a memory. And so it contrasts both of these. Poof, remember? It was the 20th century almost gone. This language here feels really abrupt, really sudden. It's just like a shock, like, oh, right, like we're back to the present, and this memory that had felt so real is just in the past now. We were there, and when we went to put it back where it belonged, it was past us and we were changed really quick. It was the 20th century almost gone. This is a direct reference to the turn of the century because this poem was published in 2003, right after the turn of the century. And this is metaphorical wording because we can't literally put the 20th century back where it belongs, but it adds to the narrator's effect. It was past us and we were changed. So, not just society, not just the world, but we were changed implies that we were changed and we had this moment where we're sitting there and we are changed and not just the things around us. So this relates to society in a lot of different ways. For this time period, this was obviously published in 2003, right after the turn of the century, and this wasn't just a thing in America, it was a thing over the world. Everybody was experiencing this great period of change. Serena and Venus Williams were gaining popularity. These were two very, very popular tennis players. I included a picture of them below. Super monumental and super groundbreaking in the field of women's tennis. They had a lot of champion titles. And I feel like the author kind of wrote this poem kind of referencing them because there are a lot of similarities in this poem between the two aspects. And racism was still somewhat common. And I don't want to say common, but I feel like it was more internalized instead of externalized. And so some people still have this idea of, just unfamiliarity with culture, and it kind of plays a role in their personal opinions there. So this relates to society today in a lot of different ways as well. I mean, throughout our country and the world, many changes are taking place. Throughout America with new presidencies and our world, there's just a lot of different changes that are always happening, which brings me to my next point. Change is always happening, it's inevitable, and we can't avoid it. And many people still have biased views and stereotypes of others, and this poem addresses that, in the time period, but it also still applies to today and the things that are going on today. So I have three major themes that I notice in the change. Number one would be racial stereotypes and unfamiliarity can affect personal opinions. And a quote that I feel like really, really represented this was, I couldn't help wanting the white girl to come out on top because she was one of my kind, my tribe. And this really helps us get a view of why the narrator is thinking the way he does, because he is unfamiliar with this race. And this thought process that he's having is, affecting his personal decision on who he wants to win in this tennis match. Number two is change can pass us by subtly and oftentimes go unnoticed. A quote I have to represent this is, "Poof, remember, it was the 20th century almost gone, we were there." And so this is kind of tying in those elements of change, and it's passing us by slowly as we don't realize it throughout the poem. And then at the end of the poem, we notice that, oh, it's already changed, it's already happened, and it's done. And so we didn't notice that, or I personally didn't notice that as I was reading the poem. And number three, this is kind of a less obvious theme, but it can be easy to objectify women while describing them. So we can see this when the narrator says that some tough little European blonde pitted against that big black girl from Alabama, lines 9 and 10. Just as he's casually kind of describing them, we kind of get the sense that they're kind of being objectified, and not necessarily just in a downright, the narrator is trying to objectify them, but just in a way that's kind of just the way he wants to talk about them. It's just easy for him. So the mood and tone in this poem is conversational, blunt, and straightforward. He's having a conversation with us actively. It's not formal by any means. Some quotes that I have to kind of represent this would be, sometimes I think that nothing really changes, kind of tying back to that first part of the poem where we're getting a sense for he's just kind of telling us, he's having a conversation with us. He's not giving some fancy presentation or anything. He's just like talking with a friend. And also when he says, as that black girl wore down her opponent, then kicked her ass good, then thumped her once more for good measure. And this is really strong because we see that he's definitely not talking to anybody important. He's just describing what happened through his eyes. The poem pattern here is going to be free verse with a few rhymes thrown in throughout. There's definitely not any noticeable patterns in this poem that I've personally noticed. It feels very free verse, very just how Tony Hoagland would write a poem. Some quotes that I have for this. And you loved her complicated hair and her to hell with everybody's stare. So this is an example of a rhyme that he uses. He only uses two rhymes throughout his poem, but I thought they were important to note nonetheless because it is kind of a pattern, but these rhymes don't follow any particular pattern or shape or form. And then this quote down here, there are moments when history passes you so close you can smell its breath, you can reach your hand out and touch it on its flank. We kind of get a feel for how he writes his poems. He's putting emphasis on different lines and different parts that he has in there. And that's how his poem is structured, is just where he wants to put his emphasis on his words. Who is the narrator? So we know for sure that this narrator is white because he mentions a connection to the white tennis player. He says, because she was one of my kind, my tribe. So we know that he shares similarities with this white tennis player. He's most likely male, because he uses objectifying language on the women. He says, pitted against that big black girl from Alabama. Now, this is open to interpretation because we don't specifically know if this narrator is a male, but in my opinion, I would assume that he's a male. And he's not directly racist. His racism is internalized. Like, he's not directly trying to like hate on this black character. He says, I couldn't help wanting the white girl to come out on top, as if like he just couldn't help it. He's not purposefully trying to be harmful. He's just unfamiliar with this black girl. So I chose The Change because it's well written, sincere, and it's a great metaphor for society's changes. I feel like no matter what time period you could be in, this poem would still be relevant because there are just so many changes that are always constantly passing. It reminds me to live in the moment because, the way it describes change being so fleeting and so undetectable until it's already done. And it just reminds me that I need to enjoy the present moment. And it also reminds me that constant change is okay because everything is constantly changing. And instead of denying it, you should try to embrace it and go with the flow. And it connects back to my own life as I'm experiencing a period of great change as well. I'm a senior in high school. I'll be graduating soon and turning 18. So this is a really big period of change for me in my life. And this poem kind of connects some aspects back to what I'm feeling in this moment. And then my favorite lines would be, there are moments when history passes you so close, you can smell its breath. It kind of transitions away from this blunt and informal language into something that feels like a really important and monumental kind of moment here. And it was just personally one of my favorite lines and then I also really appreciate the personification. It's just really detailed and I enjoy it. So, some questions for the class I have would be number one, do you criticize or empathize with the narrator's bias and why? Have you ever been in a situation where you've been biased towards something? I know I have, and I just want to see what everybody else's opinions are about how this narrator thinks and if he's in the wrong or if he's not in the wrong. Number two, this poem was written at the turn of the century. If it were written today, how do you think it would be interpreted differently? So, if this poem were written in modern times, do you think the author would have included a different historical event? And how would this be interpreted by the people, by the audience? Number three, if this poem were written in third person, would the audience be able to sympathize with the narrator in the same way? Why or why not? In my opinion, the audience would not be able to sympathize with this narrator in the same way because this poem being written in first person really adds on to the effect and helps us get a glimpse into how the narrator is thinking as if he is actually talking to us. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. This is my presentation on The Change by Tony Hoagland. Again, if you have any questions, anything that you want to ask or point out, feel free to comment that. And I would always like to hear from you guys. So I hope you guys have a great day.